By the middle decades of the 1st century AD, a Christian community existed in Rome. This is established by near-contemporaneous written evidence rather than by later tradition. What cannot be established from that evidence is the presence of a centralized leadership office, a monarchical bishop, or anything resembling the later institution retrospectively labeled the papacy. Rome in the mid-1st century AD was the largest city in the Mediterranean world and the administrative center of the Roman Empire. Population estimates range from several hundred thousand to more than 1 million inhabitants. The city was governed by imperial officials and characterized by sharp social inequality, extensive slavery, and constant population movement. Religious life was diverse and largely decentralized, consisting of state cults, household practices, and voluntary associations. Christianity emerged in this environment as a small, unofficial movement without legal recognition. The earliest direct evidence for Christians in Rome comes from a letter written by Paul of Tarsus around AD 57, commonly known as the Epistle to the Romans. The letter is addressed to an established community that Paul had not founded and had not yet visited. This indicates that Christianity reached Rome through multiple informal channels rather than through a single missionary initiative. The letter presupposes familiarity with Christian teaching and practice, suggesting that the community had existed for some time before Paul wrote. Paul's letter provides several historically important points. First, it indicates the presence of multiple Christian groups within the city. Paul greets individuals and households scattered across Rome rather than addressing a single congregation or meeting place. This pattern corresponds to what is known from other early Christian contexts, where small groups met in private homes rather than in centralized or purpose-built structures. Second, Paul's letter does not name a single leader or governing official for the Roman Christians. No individual is addressed as holding overarching authority. Greetings are extended to a range of people who appear to have been active within their local circles. This absence is historically significant. It suggests that no centralized or publicly represented governing office existed within the Roman Christian community during this period. This conclusion must be framed carefully. Paul's silence does not, by itself, prove the complete absence of leadership. Rather, it strongly suggests that whatever leadership existed was not centralized or publicly represented by a single office. In other letters, Paul names prominent figures and addresses leadership roles when they are relevant. His failure to do so here points to a community structure that did not depend on a monarchical or territorially defined authority. The organizational pattern implied by Paul's letter aligns with broader early Christian practice. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, Christian groups formed through personal relationships and shared practices such as teaching and communal meals. Roles existed, but they were functional rather than institutionalized. Individuals taught, coordinated, or hosted gatherings, but these activities did not constitute fixed offices with defined jurisdiction. Authority operated through reputation, experience, and mutual recognition rather than through formal appointment. It is important to distinguish between organization and centralization. The Roman Christian community was not unstructured. Coordination is implied by the circulation of letters, shared ethical expectations, and common ritual practices. However, coordination does not require a centralized governing office. The surviving evidence supports an organization without hierarchy and structure without a singular head. Roman administrative sources from this period are silent on Christian leadership. This silence must be interpreted within its limits. Roman officials did not systematically document small, unofficial religious groups unless they became visible through public disturbance or legal conflict. The absence of references to Christian leaders does not demonstrate that the community did not exist. It does indicate that no Christian figure held a publicly recognized status comparable to civic or priestly offices within Roman administration. This context matters. Christianity in the mid-1st century AD was not a legally defined religion. It had no public temples, no state-recognized priesthood, and no formal hierarchy visible to imperial authorities. Its gatherings took place in private settings and were largely indistinguishable from other household activities. Under these conditions, the emergence of a centralized leadership office would have been both impractical and historically unsupported. The language used by early Christians reflects this stage of development. Terms that later acquired technical meanings had not yet become fixed titles. Words such as episkopos, overseer, and presbyteros, elder, were drawn from common Greek usage and applied flexibly. In the mid-1st century AD, these terms described functions rather than offices. There is no evidence from Rome in this period that such terms denoted a singular, citywide authority, even though similar terminology appears in other early Christian contexts. This decentralized structure helps explain how Christianity spread within Rome. The city's dense population, constant movement, and overlapping social networks favored small, adaptable groups. A movement organized through interconnected households rather than formal administration could expand without attracting official attention. Growth depended on personal contact and shared practices rather than on institutional control. The presence of a substantial Jewish population in Rome also shaped early Christian organization. Christianity emerged from Jewish contexts, and early Christian groups often overlapped socially and culturally with Jewish communities. Roman authorities initially viewed Christians as a Jewish subgroup. Jewish communal organization in Rome was likewise plural and localized, centered on synagogues rather than on a centralized institution. This environment further reduced the likelihood of a single, citywide Christian authority in the earliest period. The absence of centralized leadership in Rome during the 40–60s AD should not be understood as a deficiency. It reflects the early stage of Christian development and the social conditions under which the movement operated. Authority existed, but it was distributed. Influence flowed through teaching, correspondence, and personal example rather than through office or title. Later historical narratives sometimes project backward the structures that emerged in subsequent centuries. In the case of Rome, this has led to the assumption that a bishop or equivalent figure must have existed from the beginning. The surviving evidence does not support this assumption. Instead, it shows a community that functioned effectively without a centralized governing office during its earliest decades. By the end of this period, around the 60s AD, the Roman Christian community remained decentralized. It had grown in size and diversity, but its organizational structure had not yet undergone the transformations that would occur later. Leadership remained functional, local, and plural. Communication with other Christian communities took place through letters and personal travel rather than through formal administrative channels. This earliest phase establishes the baseline for the documentary narrative. It demonstrates that Christianity in Rome began as a network of house-based groups without a centralized governing office. It confirms that no contemporaneous evidence supports the existence of a monarchical bishop or papal figure during this time. It also provides the necessary context for understanding subsequent developments as change rather than continuity. By the middle decades of the 1st century AD, Christianity had spread across several regions of the Roman Empire. Communities existed in Judea, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy, including Rome. Despite differences in language, culture, and local conditions, these early Christian groups shared a broadly similar pattern of organization. Leadership existed, but it was not expressed through fixed offices with clearly defined jurisdiction. Authority functioned through roles, relationships, and communication rather than through formal institutional structures. The surviving evidence for this period comes primarily from letters written by early Christian figures, most notably Paul of Tarsus. These letters were composed between approximately AD 50 and AD 60 and addressed to communities in cities such as Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Rome. They are near-contemporaneous sources and provide the clearest insight into how early Christian authority operated. What they consistently show is a form of leadership defined by activity and recognition rather than by office and hierarchy. Two Greek terms appear repeatedly in 1st century Christian texts when leadership is discussed: episkopos and presbyteros. In later centuries, these words would acquire technical meanings, referring to bishops and priests within a structured hierarchy. In the 1st century AD, however, their usage was fluid. Episkopos literally meant overseer, while presbyteros meant elder. Both terms were drawn from everyday Greek language and could be applied in a variety of social contexts, including civic administration, household management, and voluntary associations. In early Christian usage, these terms described functions rather than ranks. An episkopos was someone who oversaw certain activities. A presbyteros was someone recognized for age, experience, or standing. The evidence does not support the existence of a sharp distinction between these roles in the 1st century AD, nor does it indicate that they were tied to a single individual exercising exclusive authority over an entire city. Instead, they appear to refer to multiple people within a community who carried out different responsibilities. This pattern is visible across Paul's letters. In his correspondence with the Philippians, for example, Paul addresses overseers and servants in the plural, not a single leader. This plural usage is historically significant. It indicates that leadership was shared and that multiple individuals could perform overlapping roles within the same community. The language does not imply a chain of command or a centralized authority structure. Paul's letters also reveal how authority was exercised without a formal office. Instruction, correction, and coordination took place through correspondence and personal visits. Paul did not claim routine administrative control over the communities he addressed. His authority rested on his role as a founder or teacher and on the recognition granted to him by the communities themselves. Even then, his authority was not absolute. His letters often respond to disputes, disagreements, and challenges, indicating that local communities retained a significant degree of autonomy. This distinction between influence and administration is crucial. Apostolic figures such as Paul, Peter, and others moved between communities, taught, and communicated across regions. Their authority was translocal, but it was not bureaucratic. They did not function as permanent administrators of specific cities. Instead, they operated within networks defined by travel, letters, and personal relationships. This form of authority cannot be equated with later ecclesiastical offices. The Roman Empire provided the infrastructure that made this networked form of leadership possible. Roads, shipping routes, and urban centers facilitated movement and communication. Letters could travel relatively quickly between major cities, and individuals moved frequently for trade, work, or migration. Christianity spread through these same channels. Leadership adapted to this environment by remaining flexible and decentralized. Voluntary associations in the Roman world offer a useful comparison. Many such groups existed, organized around trade, burial arrangements, or religious devotion. They typically had officers, but these roles were often limited in scope and defined by function rather than by permanent authority. Early Christian communities shared some similarities with these associations, particularly in their reliance on shared practices and mutual recognition rather than formal hierarchy. However, Christianity differed in its emphasis on teaching, ethical instruction, and communication across cities. The absence of formal offices did not mean the absence of order. Communities developed norms for behavior, worship, and dispute resolution. Letters such as Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians address specific issues of conduct and organization. These texts show that leadership involved guiding communal life rather than enforcing rules through institutional power. Correction and instruction were carried out through persuasion, example, and appeal to shared beliefs. It is also important to note what the evidence does not show. There is no indication in first-century Christian texts that any individual held exclusive authority over all Christian groups in a city. There is no reference to a permanent, singular office responsible for governance, discipline, and doctrine in a territorially defined area. Such concepts emerge later and must not be projected backward into this period. Uncertainty remains regarding the precise internal arrangements of individual communities. The surviving sources were not written as administrative manuals. They address specific situations and concerns, leaving many details unrecorded. For example, while plural leadership is implied, the exact number of leaders, the method of their recognition, and the duration of their roles cannot be established with precision. These limits must be acknowledged rather than filled with assumptions. The apostolic period also predates the conditions that later encouraged institutional consolidation. Christianity was still a minority movement without legal recognition. Public visibility carried risks, including social marginalization and, at times, official scrutiny. A decentralized structure reduced vulnerability and allowed communities to adapt to local conditions. Leadership defined by function rather than office suited this context. By the 60s AD, the situation began to change gradually. Christian communities grew in number and size. Communication networks expanded. The deaths of early apostles removed some of the translocal figures who had provided informal cohesion. These developments created pressures that would eventually lead to more stable forms of local leadership. The Roman Christian community must be understood within this broader framework. The absence of a centralized office in Rome during the mid-1st century AD reflects the general pattern of early Christian organization. Authority existed, but it was relational and functional. Leadership roles were real, but they were not institutionalized in a way that resembles later ecclesiastical structures. This has direct implications for later historical claims. When later centuries sought to trace a continuous line of leadership back to the apostles, they applied categories that did not yet exist. The language of office, succession, and jurisdiction belongs to a later phase of Christian history. In the apostolic period, leadership operated without those categories. By the late 1st century AD, the conditions that had sustained this flexible model were beginning to change. For now, the evidence supports a clear conclusion for this period. Between the 50s and 80s AD, Christian authority was exercised without fixed offices, without centralized governance, and without a monarchical leader in Rome or elsewhere. Leadership existed, but it was distributed. Influence operated through teaching, correspondence, and recognition rather than through title or jurisdiction. This reality forms the necessary context for understanding all subsequent developments in the history of Roman Christian leadership. By the later decades of the 1st century AD, memories of the earliest Christian figures began to circulate more widely among Christian communities. Among these figures, Peter occupies a prominent place. Later tradition would associate Peter closely with Rome and would eventually identify him as the first bishop of that city. The task of historical analysis, however, is to determine what can be established from recorded evidence produced in or near the period itself, and what belongs instead to later reconstruction. The historical Peter emerges in the earliest Christian writings as a leading figure among Jesus' followers. He appears frequently in sources that predate any developed ecclesiastical structure. These texts present Peter as an itinerant preacher and participant in early Christian disputes, not as an administrator of a fixed institution. What matters for the present inquiry is not Peter's importance within early Christianity, which is well attested, but the nature of his relationship to Rome and whether that relationship can be described in administrative or institutional terms. Direct, contemporaneous Roman records from the 60s AD do not mention Peter. This absence is not surprising. Roman administrative sources did not normally record the activities of individuals associated with small, unofficial religious movements unless those activities intersected with matters of public order or legal concern. Christianity, at this stage, remained marginal and largely invisible to the state. The lack of Roman documentation, therefore, neither confirms nor denies Peter's presence in Rome. It does, however, place strict limits on what can be asserted with certainty. The earliest Christian source that refers to Peter's death is a letter traditionally known as 1 Clement, written from Rome around AD 96. This text is near contemporaneous relative to the events it recalls, but it is still separated from Peter's lifetime by several decades. In this letter, Peter is mentioned alongside Paul as an example of faithful endurance under suffering. The text refers to their deaths, but does not provide details regarding location, circumstances, or administrative roles. Rome is not explicitly named as the place of Peter's death, although the letter's Roman origin has led later readers to infer such a connection. This inference must be treated cautiously. 1 Clement presumes that its audience is familiar with the events it references, but it does not document them. The text offers no chronological markers, no geographic specification, and no description of Peter's function within the Roman Christian community. It presents Peter as a figure of memory and moral example, not as a local official or governing authority. The form and purpose of 1 Clement are significant. The letter addresses a dispute in the Christian community at Corinth and appeals to earlier examples of endurance to encourage order and reconciliation. It does not ground its argument in claims of Roman administrative authority or apostolic succession. Instead, it speaks in the collective voice of the Roman Christian community and draws on shared traditions. This context reinforces the conclusion that Peter is invoked as a revered figure from the past, not as the founder of an ongoing office. Other first-century Christian texts are silent regarding Peter's role in Rome. The letters of Paul, written earlier, do not place Peter in Rome during the period covered by those letters. This silence cannot be used to establish Peter's absence, but it does underscore the lack of contemporaneous documentation for a sustained Roman role. Paul refers to Peter in other contexts, including disputes over missionary practice, but does not describe him as exercising authority over the Roman community. By the early 2nd century AD, Christian writings begin to show increased interest in tracing connections between communities and earlier figures. Even here, however, the evidence remains limited. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around AD 110, addresses the Roman Christian community with respect, but does not mention Peter as a former leader or founder of a Roman office. Ignatius refers to Peter and Paul elsewhere as authoritative figures, yet he does not connect Peter explicitly with Roman administration. This omission is notable given Ignatius' concern with leadership structures in other cities. The silence of Ignatius does not disprove Peter's presence in Rome, but it does argue against the existence of a widely recognized tradition at that time identifying Peter as a former bishop or administrative head of the Roman Church. If such a tradition had been firmly established and central to Roman identity by the early 2nd century, it would likely have appeared in a context where Ignatius was concerned with authority and order. Later sources, written from the mid-2nd century onward, begin to associate Peter more explicitly with Rome. These sources, however, are separated from the events they describe by considerable chronological distance. They emerge in a context where Christian communities were increasingly concerned with continuity, legitimacy, and the stabilization of leadership. In this setting, memories of apostolic figures were organized into narratives that supported emerging institutional structures. It is at this later stage that Peter is retrospectively identified as the first bishop of Rome. This identification depends on assumptions that did not exist in the 1st century AD. It presumes a defined office, a clear line of succession, and a territorial understanding of authority. From a historical perspective, the most that can be said with confidence is that Peter was remembered by late 1st century Christians as a significant early figure who suffered and died. An association with Rome is plausible given later traditions and the city's importance within Christianity, but it is not documented by 1st century evidence. Even if Peter was present in Rome at some point, the surviving sources do not describe him as exercising ongoing administrative authority over the Roman Christian community. This distinction between presence and office is critical. The early Christian movement did not equate presence in a city with institutional leadership over that city. Apostolic figures traveled, taught, and engaged in disputes across regions. Their authority was personal and relational, not bureaucratic. Applying later categories of office to this period introduces anachronism. The social and political context of Rome in the 60s AD further complicates the picture. This period included episodes of tension and violence, including state actions against certain groups. Christian memory of suffering during this time reflects broader experiences of instability rather than organized persecution directed by specific administrative processes. The surviving Christian sources do not provide detailed accounts of events in Rome during these years, and later narratives must not be treated as contemporaneous reports. As Christian communities entered the late 1st century AD, The deaths of early figures such as Peter and Paul took on increasing symbolic importance. Their memories were preserved through oral tradition and occasional written reference. These memories served as points of reference for later generations seeking continuity with the movement's origins. However, memory does not function as an administrative record. It reflects values and identity rather than institutional detail. The absence of clear evidence for Peter's administrative role in Rome does not diminish his historical importance. It clarifies the nature of that importance. Peter's significance lies in his role within the formative period of Christianity, not in the establishment of an office that did not yet exist. Recognizing this distinction allows the historical record to be read without imposing later structures on earlier realities. By the end of the 1st century AD, Rome remained a community whose authority was exercised collectively rather than through a single office. Peter's memory formed part of its shared past, but it did not define its present governance. The association between Peter and Rome, as it appears in near-contemporaneous sources, is limited, indirect, and non-administrative. This conclusion sets the stage for the next phase of the narrative. In the 2nd century AD, as Christian communities began to develop more stable leadership structures, earlier figures were reinterpreted within new frameworks. Understanding the limited and indirect nature of Peter's association with Rome in the 1st century is essential for evaluating those later developments. At this point in the documentary chronology, the evidence supports a careful conclusion. During the 60s to 90s AD, Peter was remembered as a foundational figure of early Christianity whose death became part of communal memory. An association with Rome is plausible, but not documented in detail. No 1st century source identifies Peter as a bishop of Rome or assigns him institutional authority within that community. Claims to that effect belong to later periods and must be understood as retrospective constructions rather than contemporaneous historical facts. By the final years of the 1st century AD, the Roman Christian community had existed for several decades. Its size had increased. Its internal memory of earlier figures had begun to stabilize, and its connections with other Christian communities were well established. Yet, despite these developments, the surviving evidence still does not indicate the presence of a centralized, monarchical governing office in Rome. The most important source for assessing Roman Christian leadership at this stage is a single text, the letter traditionally known as 1 Clement, written from Rome around AD 96. This document occupies a critical position in the historical record. It is the earliest surviving Christian writing that can be securely located in Rome, and it offers the clearest window into how the Roman community represented itself at the end of the 1st century. Because of its importance, 1 Clement has often been interpreted through the lens of later ecclesiastical structures. For historical analysis, however, the text must be read on its own terms, with careful attention to what it says, what it does not say, and how it presents authority. The letter is addressed to the Christian community in Corinth. It responds to a dispute in which certain long-established leaders had been removed from their positions. The Roman community intervenes by urging restoration of order and continuity. This intervention itself is historically significant. It demonstrates that Rome was regarded as a community whose counsel carried weight beyond its own boundaries. At the same time, the manner in which that counsel is delivered reveals how Roman authority functioned at this point. The letter is written in the name of the Roman Christian community as a whole. No individual author identifies himself. and no leader is named as issuing instructions. The opening lines speak collectively, presenting the Roman Christians as a unified body addressing another community. Throughout the document, authority is expressed corporately rather than personally. This collective voice is not incidental. It is consistent and deliberate. The absence of a named leader is one of the most important features of 1 Clement. If a single bishop or equivalent office had existed in Rome by AD 96, it would have been natural to invoke that authority explicitly, especially when addressing a disciplinary matter in another city. The letter does not do this. Instead, it appeals to shared traditions, established practices, and examples drawn from earlier generations. Authority is grounded in continuity and communal memory, not in office or title. The text uses leadership terminology, but always in the plural. It refers to presbyters and overseers as categories of service within Christian communities. These terms are applied to the Corinthian situation and discussed as offices that had been established earlier and should not be removed without cause. Importantly, the letter does not describe a single presbyter or overseer exercising supreme authority over others. Leadership is presented as distributed and collegial. The historical context of the letter further reinforces this conclusion. 1 Clement was written during or shortly after the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, who ruled from AD 81 to AD 96. This period included episodes of political tension and uncertainty. While later Christian tradition associated Domitian's reign with persecution, the surviving evidence does not indicate a systematic empire-wide campaign against Christians. Nevertheless, the Roman Christian community operated in an environment where public visibility could attract unwanted attention. In such a context, collective representation was both practical and consistent with existing patterns. Christianity remained an unofficial movement without legal recognition. Its leaders did not hold publicly acknowledged positions. Authority was exercised internally through persuasion, example, and reference to tradition rather than through formal structures recognizable to the state. The content of 1 Clement sheds further light on how authority was understood. The letter emphasizes order, continuity, and respect for established practices. It argues that leaders who had been appointed earlier should not be removed arbitrarily. The basis for this argument is not the command of a superior office, but the principle of orderly succession within the community. Even here, succession is not framed as a chain of individual office holders tracing authority back to a single figure. It is presented as a process within the community, grounded in collective agreement and tradition. The letter also draws on examples from Jewish scripture and earlier Christian experience to support its case. These references serve to situate the Corinthian dispute within a broader historical narrative of continuity and stability. They do not establish Roman jurisdiction or claim a unique authority derived from apostolic founders. The Roman community presents itself as a participant in a shared tradition, not as an arbiter by virtue of institutional supremacy. It is important to note what 1 Clement does not do. It does not mention Peter or Paul as founders of a Roman office. While it refers to the suffering and death of these figures elsewhere in the text, it does not connect them to an ongoing administrative role in Rome. Their memory functions as a moral example, not as an institutional foundation. Later ecclesiastical tradition would attribute 1 Clement to an individual named Clement and identify him as a bishop of Rome. This attribution does not come from the text itself. The letter does not name its author, nor does it describe any office held by such a person. The identification of Clement as bishop belongs to later 2nd century and 3rd century reconstructions, developed after the consolidation of monarchical episcopacy. From a historical standpoint, this later attribution cannot be used to interpret the document's original context. The transmission history of 1 Clement also underscores its early origin and communal character. The letter was preserved and copied by Christian communities outside Rome, indicating that it was valued as a text of instruction and example. Its authority is derived from its content and perceived wisdom rather than from the status of an individual author. This mode of reception is consistent with a period before fixed ecclesiastical hierarchies determined the weight of documents. The Roman intervention in Corinth should not be misunderstood as evidence of centralized governance. Influence and authority are not the same as jurisdiction. Rome's council was persuasive because of its reputation and its appeal to shared norms, not because it claimed legal or institutional control. Similar interventions occurred among other Christian communities during this period, reflecting a network of mutual accountability rather than a hierarchy. The letter's concern with order also reflects broader developments within Christianity at the end of the 1st century. As communities grew and generations changed, questions of continuity became more pressing. The deaths of early figures such as Peter and Paul created a temporal distance from the movement's origins. In this context, appeals to established practice and orderly succession served to stabilize communal life. These appeals did not require and did not produce a centralized governing office. From a Roman perspective, the continued absence of a monarchical bishop in 1 Clement is significant. Rome had the resources and connections that would later support institutional development. Yet, as of AD 96, the Roman Christian community still operated through collective authority. This suggests that the emergence of a single episcopal office in Rome was not an original feature, but a later development shaped by changing circumstances. The careful language of 1 Clement reflects an awareness of limits. The Roman community advises rather than commands. It urges restoration rather than imposing sanctions. This restraint is consistent with a world in which authority was negotiated through shared tradition rather than enforced through office. It also aligns with the broader pattern of leadership without centralized governance. Uncertainty remains regarding internal Roman organization at this time. The letter does not describe how Roman presbyters or overseers were selected, how many there were, or how responsibilities were divided. These details are not recoverable from the surviving evidence. What can be established is the absence of explicit reference to a single leader and the presence of collective representation. The importance of 1 Clement lies not only in what it reveals, but in what it excludes. It excludes the existence of a publicly acknowledged monarchical bishop in Rome at the end of the 1st century. It excludes the notion that Roman authority rested on a formal office tracing back to Peter or any other apostolic figure. It presents a community that exercises influence through shared memory, tradition, and counsel. This evidence provides a firm chronological anchor. As of AD 96, Rome had not yet developed the leadership structure that would later be associated with the papacy. Any attempt to identify a first pope in this period imposes later categories on an earlier reality. The historical record does not support such an identification. The developments observed in 1 Clement prepare the ground for what follows. The emphasis on order, continuity, and tradition would later be interpreted through emerging institutional frameworks. In the 2nd century AD, as leadership structures became more formalized, texts like 1 Clement were reread and reclassified. Figures were identified, offices were named, and succession was systematized. At the close of the 1st century AD, the Roman Christian community remained governed collectively. Its authority was real but non-institutional. Its influence extended beyond its own boundaries, but it did not claim jurisdiction. 1 Clement stands as the clearest documentary evidence of this stage in Roman Christian history. By the opening decades of the 2nd century AD, Christianity had entered a new phase of development. Communities founded in the middle of the 1st century were no longer new, and the generation that had known the earliest apostles directly was disappearing. As a result, questions of continuity, stability, and leadership became more pressing across the Christian world. It is during this period that clear evidence emerges for a new form of local authority in several regions, the monarchical episcopate, in which a single overseer functioned as the recognized focal point of a community's leadership. Crucially, this development did not occur everywhere at the same time, and Rome presents a notable contrast. The most important evidence for this shift comes from a series of letters written by Ignatius of Antioch around AD 110. Ignatius was a Christian leader from Syria who wrote to several communities while traveling under guard toward Rome. His letters are among the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament corpus and are near contemporaneous with the developments they describe. Because they address questions of leadership directly and repeatedly, they provide a valuable snapshot of how authority was understood in different Christian communities at the beginning of the 2nd century. In the letters addressed to communities in Asia Minor, Ignatius consistently emphasizes the role of a single bishop in each city. He urges Christians to act in unity with their bishop, presbyters, and deacons, presenting this threefold structure as the proper organization of communal life. The bishop is portrayed as the central point of coordination, responsible for maintaining order and cohesion. This language represents a significant development from the plural and functional leadership patterns observed in the 1st century. The importance of Ignatius' testimony lies not only in what he affirms, but in where he affirms it. The communities he addresses, such as those in Ephesus, Smyrna, and Magnesia, are described as already possessing a recognizable leadership structure centered on a single bishop. Ignatius does not argue for the creation of such a structure. He presumes its existence. This indicates that, by around AD 110, the monarchical episcopate had become established in at least some regions of the Christian world. At the same time, Ignatius' letters reveal that this structure was not yet universal. His correspondence includes a letter addressed to the Roman Christian community, and it differs markedly in tone and content from his other letters. When writing to Rome, Ignatius does not mention a bishop, presbyters, or deacons. He does not urge obedience to a singular leader or emphasize hierarchical order. Instead, he addresses the Roman Christians collectively and focuses on his own impending death. This contrast is historically significant. Ignatius was deeply concerned with leadership and unity, and he had no hesitation in naming and reinforcing episcopal authority where it existed. His silence regarding a Roman bishop cannot be dismissed as accidental. It suggests that, as of the early 2nd century AD, Rome did not yet present itself as a community organized around a publicly recognized monarchical bishop, or at least not in a manner comparable to the communities of Asia Minor. This silence must be interpreted with caution. It does not prove that no form of episcopal leadership existed in Rome at all. What it indicates is that such leadership, if present, had not yet assumed the same public and structural prominence that Ignatius encountered elsewhere. The Roman community appears to have retained a more collective mode of representation, consistent with the pattern observed in 1 Clement at the end of the 1st century. The uneven development of leadership structures reflects the diversity of early Christianity. Communities emerged in different social, cultural, and administrative environments, and they adapted accordingly. Cities in Asia Minor often had long-established civic traditions with clear administrative offices, which may have influenced how Christian leadership evolved. Rome, by contrast, was a vast and complex metropolis where Christian groups remained small relative to the overall population and dispersed across numerous neighborhoods. The Roman administrative context is relevant here. Rome was governed directly by imperial authority, and public associations were subject to scrutiny. A highly visible, centralized leadership structure might have attracted attention that decentralized groups could avoid. While the evidence does not allow conclusions about intentional strategies, it does suggest that local conditions shaped how leadership structures developed. The emergence of monarchical bishops elsewhere also coincided with broader changes within Christianity. As communities grew and multiplied, the need for coordination increased. Disputes over teaching and practice became more frequent, and the absence of living apostolic figures created a vacuum of authority. A single bishop could serve as a stabilizing figure, providing continuity and a focal point for communal identity. Ignatius' letters reflect this logic, even though they do not explain how or why the system arose. Rome's apparent divergence from this pattern in the early 2nd century highlights an important historical point. The later prominence of the Roman bishop should not be projected backward as an original feature. In fact, during the period when monarchical episcopacy is clearly attested elsewhere, Rome appears to have lagged or followed a different trajectory. This challenges later narratives that assume Rome's leadership structure was always more developed or authoritative than that of other communities. The evidence also clarifies the nature of authority in this transitional period. Even in communities with monarchical bishops, authority was still embedded in networks of recognition and tradition rather than enforced through legal or institutional mechanisms. Bishops derive their authority from communal acceptance and from alignment with inherited teaching. This reinforces the continuity between 1st century functional leadership and 2nd century institutional forms. Ignatius' respect for the Roman community further complicates simplistic hierarchies. He addresses Rome with unusual deference, describing it as a community of great influence. Yet he does not ground this respect in reference to a Roman bishop or to apostolic succession. Influence and authority remain distinct. Rome's importance appears to derive from its position, history, and reputation rather than from a defined leadership office. This distinction is critical for understanding later developments. The growth of Roman influence preceded the consolidation of Roman episcopal authority. The community mattered before its leadership structure became singular. This sequence undermines the idea that Rome's later ecclesiastical prominence originated in a uniquely early or superior institutional arrangement. Uncertainty remains regarding the precise internal organization of the Roman community during this period. Ignatius does not describe how Roman Christians selected leaders, how many presbyters they had, or how responsibilities were divided. These details are not recoverable from the surviving evidence. What can be stated with confidence is that Rome did not yet present itself to external observers as a community governed by a single bishop in the early 2nd century AD. The comparative evidence from Ignatius' letters also helps establish a relative chronology. Monarchical episcopacy is clearly attested in Asia Minor by around AD 110. In Rome, comparable evidence does not appear until later in the 2nd century. This suggests a developmental process rather than a simultaneous or uniform change across Christianity. By the end of the period, Christianity was moving toward greater institutional definition, but the process was uneven. Rome remained distinctive in its continued reliance on collective authority, even as other communities embraced more centralized leadership. This situation would not remain static. Over the course of the 2nd century AD, Rome's leadership structure would evolve, influenced by internal needs and external pressures. For this documentary, the significance of this period lies in what it demonstrates about timing. The emergence of monarchical episcopacy was not an original feature of Christianity, nor was it uniquely Roman in its earliest form. It developed gradually and unevenly. Rome's later role as the center of the papacy cannot be understood without recognizing that, in the early 2nd century, Rome had not yet adopted the leadership model already present elsewhere. This conclusion further constrains claims about a first pope. If Rome did not yet have a publicly recognized monarchical bishop around AD 110, then the identification of a first pope must belong to a later period. Any attempt to locate such a figure in the 1st century or early 2nd century ignores the chronological evidence. As the documentary moves forward, attention will shift to how Roman leadership began to be remembered and reconstructed in later sources. By the middle decades of the 2nd century AD, Christianity was no longer only a movement sustained by the living memory of its earliest figures. Communities were now separated from the apostolic generation by time, distance, and demographic change. As a result, questions of continuity became increasingly important. How had leadership been transmitted? Who had guided communities after the deaths of the earliest figures? In Rome, these questions would eventually produce lists of names presented as early leaders of the community. Among the most frequently cited were Linus, Cletus, also called Anacletus, and Clement. The first and most important point is chronological. No contemporaneous source from the 1st century AD identifies Linus, Cletus, or Clement as holders of a singular governing office in Rome. Their association with Roman leadership emerges only in sources written decades later, after leadership structures had begun to consolidate elsewhere in the Christian world. This gap between the period described and the period of documentation must frame any historical analysis. Clement occupies a distinctive position among these figures because his name is later associated with a surviving text, the letter known as 1 Clement, written from Rome around AD 96. It does not identify its author, nor does it name any individual as holding a governing office. The association between Clement and this letter appears only in later tradition, beginning in the 2nd century AD and becoming more standardized in the 3rd. From a historical perspective, this means that Clement's connection to Roman leadership is indirect. The existence of 1 Clement demonstrates that the Roman community was capable of coordinated action and external intervention at the end of the 1st century. It does not demonstrate that an individual named Clement functioned as a monarchical bishop. The later identification of Clement as both author and bishop reflects retrospective interpretation rather than evidence preserved in the document itself. Linus and Cletus present an even clearer case of retrospective construction. Unlike Clement, they are not associated with any surviving first-century text. Their names appear in later episcopal lists that attempt to reconstruct a sequence of Roman leaders following the deaths of Peter and Paul. These lists are not contemporaneous records. They were compiled after monarchical episcopacy had become an accepted norm and reflect the categories and assumptions of that later period. The earliest surviving source to provide such a list is Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around AD 180. He names Linus, Cletus, and Clement in a sequence intended to demonstrate continuity of teaching in Rome. Irenaeus' purpose was polemical. He sought to counter competing interpretations of Christian teaching by appealing to the stability and antiquity of certain communities. His list serves that argument, not the reconstruction of first-century administration. This distinction is critical. A list constructed for theological or polemical purposes cannot be treated as an administrative archive. It reflects what later Christians believed about their past, not necessarily how that past was structured. Irenaeus wrote nearly a century after the events he describes. His access to earlier records is unknown, and his account cannot be independently corroborated by first-century sources. Later writers would repeat and modify these lists. Variations appear in the order of names and in the spelling of Cletus or Anacletus, indicating instability in the tradition. Such variation is a hallmark of retrospective memory rather than contemporaneous documentation. If these figures had held well-defined offices with publicly recognized authority, greater consistency would be expected in later accounts. The social context of Rome during this period helps explain how such memory formation occurred. By the early 2nd century AD, Rome was increasingly recognized as an important Christian center due to its size, resources, and connections. As leadership structures became more formalized elsewhere, there was growing interest in defining Rome's own past in similar terms. This process involved identifying earlier figures who could be presented as predecessors to the emerging episcopal office. It is important to emphasize that the appearance of Linus, Cletus, and Clement in later lists does not imply fabrication. These names likely refer to real individuals remembered within the Roman Christian community. What cannot be established is the nature of their roles. They may have been respected teachers, prominent presbyters, or coordinators within the community. The surviving evidence does not allow these possibilities to be distinguished. The key issue is not whether these individuals existed, but whether they held a centralized governing office comparable to the later Roman episcopate. On this point, the evidence is silent. No first-century or early 2nd century source describes Linus, Cletus, or Clement exercising exclusive authority over the Roman Christian community. No document from their lifetime assigns them jurisdiction, succession, or administrative control. As of AD 96, 1 Clement presents Rome as governed collectively. As of around AD 110, Ignatius of Antioch does not mention a Roman bishop. These two data points bracket the period during which Linus, Cletus, and Clement are later placed. The absence of evidence for a monarchical office during this interval makes it historically unlikely that such an office existed but went entirely unmentioned. The development of episcopal lists should therefore be understood as part of a later effort to impose order on an earlier, less structured past. As Christian communities adopted monarchical episcopacy as a normative model, they sought to trace that model backward to the apostolic age. This required identifying a sequence of leaders who could be presented as predecessors, even if their original roles did not match the later office. This process did not occur only in Rome. Similar retrospective constructions appear in other communities, where earlier figures are later described as bishops despite the absence of contemporaneous evidence for such offices. The Roman case is distinctive only because of the later prominence of the Roman episcopate. That prominence magnified the significance of its reconstructed past. The administrative realities of early Christian communities further complicate the picture. Record-keeping was limited, informal, and often local. Leadership transitions were not documented systematically. Oral memory played a central role in preserving communal history. Over time, oral memory tends to simplify and standardize narratives, especially when integrated into institutional frameworks. By the mid-2nd century AD, Christianity faced new challenges. Disputes over teaching intensified, and communities sought stable points of reference. Lists of leaders provided a way to assert continuity and legitimacy. In this context, names like Linus, Cletus, and Clement became anchors in a developing narrative of succession. What is crucial for historical analysis is recognizing the direction of influence. The office shaped the memory, not the other way around. Once a monarchical episcopate became established in Rome, earlier figures were reinterpreted as occupants of that office. This does not mean that the office existed when they lived. It means that later generations understood the past through the lens of their present structures. The evidence also shows that this process unfolded gradually. Early lists are brief and lack detail. Later accounts expand and embellish. The association of Clement with one Clement becomes more explicit over time, even though the original text does not support such attribution. These developments illustrate how historical memory evolves in response to institutional needs. Uncertainty remains unavoidable. It is possible that individuals such as Linus or Clement exercised forms of leadership that are not fully captured in surviving sources. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in an absolute sense. However, historical methodology requires that conclusions be limited to what can be demonstrated. In this case, what can be demonstrated is the absence of documentation for a centralized office. This conclusion reinforces the broader narrative developed across the documentary. The idea of a clearly defined first pope presupposes a stable office with identifiable occupants. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, the process of institutional consolidation was advancing. Rome would eventually develop a stable monarchical episcopate, and with it, a more formalized sense of succession. The memory of earlier figures would be absorbed into this new framework. Understanding that process requires distinguishing between lived history and remembered history. At this stage in the documentary chronology, Rome stands at an intermediate point. It has not yet produced clear evidence of a singular episcopal authority, but it has begun to generate narratives that will later support such an authority. The names of Linus, Cletus, and Clement occupy this transitional space between functional leadership and institutional memory. By the latter decades of the 2nd century AD, Christianity had entered a phase in which questions of continuity, authority, and legitimacy were addressed with increasing urgency. The generation with direct contact to the earliest Christian figures had passed. Communities now faced internal disagreements over teaching and practice, as well as external pressures that required clearer definitions of identity. It is within this context that the first explicit attempts to present a linear succession of Roman leaders appear in surviving sources. The most influential of these attempts is found in the work of Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around AD 180. Irenaeus did not write as a chronicler compiling an administrative history. He wrote as a polemicist responding to what he regarded as false teachings circulating among Christian groups. His primary concern was doctrinal continuity, not institutional documentation. Nevertheless, his work contains the earliest surviving list that presents a sequence of Roman leaders following the apostles. This list would become foundational for later interpretations of Roman Christian leadership and, eventually, for the concept of papal succession. Understanding the historical value and limitations of Irenaeus' testimony requires careful attention to its purpose, context, and distance from the events it describes. The list he provides is not a contemporaneous record of leadership transitions in Rome. It is a retrospective construction shaped by the needs and assumptions of the late 2nd century. Irenaeus' principal work, Against Heresies, was written to argue that certain Christian teachings were authentic because they could be traced back through recognized communities to the apostles. To support this argument, Irenaeus appealed to the idea of continuity preserved through succession. Rome occupies a prominent place in this reasoning because of its size, visibility, and perceived stability. Irenaeus presents Rome as an example of a community whose teaching could be reliably traced back to earlier generations. In presenting this argument, Irenaeus lists a sequence of Roman leaders beginning after the apostles. He names Linus, Anacletus, and Clement, followed by others, as successive figures associated with Roman leadership. The list is presented as evidence that Rome had maintained continuity of teaching over time. However, the list itself is not supported by contemporaneous documentation. Irenaeus does not cite records, letters, or administrative documents. He offers the list as a rhetorical demonstration rather than as a sourced historical account. The chronological gap is significant. Irenaeus wrote approximately 80 to 100 years after the period in which he places the earliest figures on his list. During that interval, the structure of Christian leadership had changed substantially. Irenaeus' list reflects this later model. He presents Roman leadership as a sequence of individual office holders, each succeeding the previous one. This presentation assumes a defined office that could be passed from person to person. Such an assumption is not supported by first-century evidence from Rome. Instead, it reflects the institutional norms of Irenaeus' own time. This does not mean that Irenaeus invented the names he lists. He likely drew on traditions circulating within Christian communities, possibly including Roman memory of respected earlier figures. What matters historically is how those figures are represented. In Irenaeus' account, they are aligned with an office that did not yet exist in their lifetime. The succession is constructed backward from a later institutional framework. The reliability of Irenaeus' list must therefore be evaluated in terms of its purpose. It was designed to demonstrate doctrinal stability, not to provide a detailed account of governance. The list serves as a symbolic chain linking present authority to the apostolic past. Its historical value lies in revealing how late 2nd century Christians understood continuity, not in documenting 1st century administrative reality. Further evidence of retrospective construction appears in the variation found in later lists. Subsequent writers reproduce Irenaeus' sequence with differences in order and naming. The figure known as Cletus is sometimes called Anacletus, the placement of Clement varies. Such inconsistencies suggest that there was no fixed, widely accepted record. Instead, multiple traditions were gradually harmonized over time. If a stable monarchical episcopate with clear succession had existed in Rome from the 1st century onward, greater consistency would be expected. Administrative offices typically generate records, titles, and public recognition. The absence of such evidence, combined with later variation, supports the conclusion that the succession lists reflect evolving memory rather than preserved documentation. The broader Roman context of the late 2nd century also influenced Irenaeus' presentation. Rome had become a major center of Christian activity, attracting visitors, correspondence, and attention from other communities. Its prominence made it a useful reference point in arguments about continuity. Irenaeus' emphasis on Rome should be understood in this light. It reflects Rome's contemporary importance rather than an unbroken institutional history reaching back to the apostles. It is also important to note what Irenaeus does not claim. He does not describe the Roman leader as possessing universal authority over other churches. He does not articulate a theory of papal supremacy. His concern is doctrinal reliability within a network of communities. The later development of papal authority would build on, but go beyond, the framework he provides. The concept of succession itself deserves careful examination. In Irenaeus' usage, succession refers primarily to the transmission of teaching. Leadership figures serve as markers of continuity rather than as wielders of centralized power. This distinction is often blurred in later interpretations, but remains critical for historical accuracy. Succession of teaching does not imply succession of jurisdiction. The emergence of succession lists marks a turning point in Christian self-understanding. Memory begins to be organized systematically. Earlier figures are placed into ordered sequences. The past is reshaped to meet the needs of the present. This process is not unique to Christianity. It appears in many institutions as they mature and seek to define their origins. For Rome, this process had long-term consequences. Once a linear succession was established, it became possible to speak of a continuous Roman leadership lineage. Later centuries would reinterpret this lineage as evidence of institutional continuity from the apostolic age. The idea of a first pope depends on this retrospective ordering. Historical methodology requires separating the moment of construction from the period being described. Irenaeus provides evidence for how late 2nd century Christians conceptualized their past. He does not provide direct evidence for how leadership functioned in Rome during the 1st century. Confusing these two levels results in anachronism. At the same time, the appearance of such a list indicates that Roman leadership had reached a level of stability by Irenaeus' time that made retrospective ordering plausible. Communities generally do not construct succession narratives in the absence of some form of recognized leadership. The list, therefore, points forward as much as backward. It signals that, by the late 2nd century, Rome was perceived as having a definable leadership structure, even if the details of its earlier development were reconstructed after the fact. By the middle decades of the 2nd century AD, the Roman Christian community entered a phase for which the surviving historical evidence changes in character. The change is gradual rather than abrupt. No surviving source announces the creation of a new office. No decree establishes a monarchical bishop in Rome at a fixed date. Instead, a convergence of evidence from the mid to late 2nd century AD indicates that Rome, like many other Christian communities, had come to be represented by a single overseer whose position was increasingly recognized both internally and externally. The first important feature of this period is the shift in how Roman leadership is referenced. Whereas earlier texts such as 1 Clement speak in the collective voice of the community, later 2nd century sources increasingly assume the existence of a singular Roman leader. This assumption is not yet accompanied by detailed descriptions of authority or jurisdiction, but it represents a significant change in representation. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is the way later writers refer to Rome when discussing disputes or doctrinal questions. By the late 2nd century AD, Roman leadership was treated as a stable point of reference. This does not mean that Rome exercised universal authority, but it does mean that its leadership was now sufficiently defined to be identified with a specific individual rather than with the community as a whole. The social and administrative context of this development is essential. By AD 150, Christianity had grown substantially in size and complexity. Communities existed across the Roman Empire, and communication between them had intensified. Disagreements over teaching were more frequent, and the absence of universally recognized apostles created pressure for clearer lines of authority. In many cities, the monarchical episcopate had already emerged as a practical solution to these challenges. Rome's adoption of this model appears to have occurred later than in parts of Asia Minor or Syria, but it followed similar logic. A single episcopal figure provided continuity, coordination, and a focal point for interaction with other communities. This development does not require explanation in terms of ideology or ambition. It reflects administrative adaptation to growth and complexity. Evidence for a Roman episcopate in this period comes from multiple directions. Later 2nd century authors refer to Roman bishops as identifiable figures. While the exact dates of individual office holders remain uncertain, the cumulative testimony indicates that by the latter half of the 2nd century, Rome was no longer represented exclusively through collective leadership. At the same time, it is critical to note what these sources do not claim. They do not describe the Roman bishop as possessing supreme authority over all Christians. They do not articulate doctrines of papal infallibility, universal jurisdiction, or exclusive succession. Those concepts belong to much later periods. The episcopal authority visible here is local and relational, not global and juridical. The transition from collective to singular leadership in Rome also aligns with broader institutional trends. As Christian communities became more permanent, leadership roles became more clearly defined. Responsibilities that had once been shared among several presbyters increasingly coalesced around one overseer. This process occurred unevenly and without centralized coordination, which explains why Rome's transition is difficult to date precisely. The absence of precise dating is itself an important historical fact. No surviving Roman document records the appointment of the first monarchical bishop. This absence reinforces the methodological principle applied throughout the documentary. The emergence of the Roman episcopate was a process, not an event. Assigning a single beginning year would impose false precision on the evidence. By the late 2nd century AD, however, the outlines of the Roman episcopate are clear enough to distinguish this period from earlier ones. Roman leadership is now treated as stable, continuous, and embodied in identifiable individuals. This marks the earliest point at which the institutional ancestor of the later papacy can be traced historically. It is at this juncture that later ecclesiastical narratives begin to overlap more closely with contemporaneous evidence. Succession lists constructed by authors such as Irenaeus now correspond more plausibly to an existing leadership structure. While the early portions of those lists remain retrospective, their later portions likely reflect real office holders whose authority was recognized in their own time. The Roman episcopate of the late 2nd century AD must still be understood within its historical limits. It was not yet the papacy. It did not function as a centralized governing institution for all of Christianity. Its authority was shaped by custom, reputation, and network relationships rather than by codified law. The later transformation of this office into the papacy involved additional centuries of development, conflict, and reinterpretation. Nevertheless, the emergence of a stable Roman episcopate is historically significant. It provides the necessary institutional framework upon which later claims would be built. Without this development, later assertions of papal continuity would lack even a structural foundation. The documentary's central question, often framed in popular discourse as "who was the first pope?" can now be addressed with historical clarity. There is no evidence for a first pope in the 1st century AD. There is no identifiable moment in which a papal office came into existence. What the evidence shows instead is a gradual evolution of leadership structures, culminating in the emergence of a monarchical bishop in Rome by the latter half of the 2nd century. This conclusion does not rest on the denial of tradition, but on the careful weighing of evidence. Contemporaneous sources carry more historical weight than later reconstructions. Silence matters. Changes in representation matter. When these factors are taken together, they point to a long formative process rather than a discrete founding event. By 200 AD, Rome stood as one of several major Christian centers led by a singular episcopal authority. Its later prominence would transform that office into something new. The papacy, as later defined, would emerge through additional developments that lie beyond the scope of this documentary. What can be established within the period covered here is limited but firm. Roman Christian leadership began as collective and decentralized. It remained so through the 1st century AD. It differed from other regions well into the early 2nd century. Only in the mid to late 2nd century does a stable monarchical episcopate become historically visible in Rome. This endpoint defines the outer boundary of the documentary's inquiry. It marks the transition from formative ambiguity to institutional clarity. It explains why assigning a first pope to the apostolic age is historically indefensible, and why later ecclesiastical categories must be understood as products of their own time. The documentary concludes not with a name or a date, but with a range and a process. The papacy did not begin with Peter, Linus, or Clement in the sense later tradition would claim. It emerged gradually, shaped by the realities of growth, memory, and organization in the Christian communities of the Roman Empire.